The night is still, wrapped in the kind of quiet that only a city can hold at this hour. Empty streets, distant lights blinking like lost stars, and the faint hum of traffic somewhere far off. A solitary sedan cruises down a well-lit downtown street, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Inside the car, General Marcus Reed sits at the wheel, his expression unreadable. At first glance, he might seem like just another middle-aged man in a suit, but a closer look reveals the weight he carries. His jaw is strong, his posture stiff with the years of military discipline that have become second nature. At 42, Reed is a seasoned U.S. Army general, honored, respected, and battle-tested. His uniform has long been traded for civilian attire, but the decades of service are written in his body. The way he holds himself, the quiet intensity of his gaze, the barely there lines around his eyes, as if he's seen more than anyone should. Tonight, the exhaustion from another long day of briefings and strategy sessions hangs heavily on him. But it's not just physical weariness. Something else weighs on him. The familiar sense of being caught between worlds. The world of the military, where rank speaks louder than words, and the world of everyday civilian life, where skin color can speak louder than rank. As he drives, Reed's thoughts shift back to the meeting he left behind. The stale air of the conference room, the endless stream of numbers and orders, the same tired speeches about policy changes and protocol updates, all laced with the subtle undertones of racial and systemic biases that Reed has learned to navigate over the years. It's a dance, one he's grown tired of, but it's never been easy to ignore. It's always there, simmering beneath the surface. He's fought in wars, commanded soldiers in some of the most dangerous places on earth, and earned the respect of his peers. Yet out here, on the streets of his own country, he is reminded again and again of the unspoken tension, the quiet injustices that don't need to be shouted to be felt. Reed's hands tighten on the steering wheel, a sudden unease prickling his skin. Something doesn't feel right. The flashing lights in his rearview mirror break the silence. The sudden intrusion of blue and red, harsh, insistent, forces him to glance up. His instincts kick in immediately, but as the police cruiser draws closer, Reed feels the weight of something deeper settling into his chest. The city's quiet streets now seem more oppressive, the night air more suffocating. For a man used to controlling a battlefield, this moment, the encounter that is about to unfold, feels like one he can't easily control. He pulls over to the side of the road, his pulse quickening despite his best efforts to remain calm. The soft hum of the engine idles in the background as he glances at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his reflection. The general stares back at him, but for a fleeting moment, he doesn't recognize the man in the glass. The feeling is sharp, unsettling. Tonight, something is going to change. The night had already settled into a heavy silence when the police cruiser's lights began flashing in the rearview mirror, slicing through the dark like a warning. Reed's heart skipped a beat. He knew this moment well, had felt the dread in his chest before, but it was different now. Different because tonight he wasn't wearing his uniform. Tonight he was just a man driving home from another pointless meeting, trying to shake off the fatigue that clung to him like a second skin. He pulled over, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was racing. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser was young, aggressive, a little too eager. Dunn, his nameplate read. Reed didn't know him, but the hostility in his eyes made it feel like they'd met 100 times before. Dunn's movements were sharp and deliberate, almost like he had already decided what this stop was going to be. When the officer ordered him to step out of the car, Reed's gut twisted. There was no reason for it, no explanation, no friendly exchange of words, just an immediate, almost menacing command. Reed's hand hovered over the door handle, his instincts kicking in, but he stayed still. He had been in situations like this before, on foreign soil, intense boardrooms, dealing with bureaucrats who never saw the soldiers they ordered around as anything but pawns. But this was different. This was his country, his streets, and here, despite everything he had done, despite the years of service and sacrifice, he was still just another black man in a world where some people didn't see him for who he was, but for what they assumed he must be. As Dunn leaned in, too close, almost chest to chest with Reed, his words were sharp, like daggers meant to provoke. "You think you're above this, don't you? Just because you're some general, I'm supposed to treat you different?" The air between them thickened, the accusation in Dunn's voice cutting through the night, and for the first time in a long time, Reed felt the sting of something raw, something personal. He was used to navigating danger, used to the sharp edges of war and conflict, but this, the sneer in Dunn's voice, the way he said general like it was a curse, was a kind of battlefield Reed hadn't prepared for. The tension snapped, and Reed's muscles coiled, but he kept his voice even. He wasn't going to back down. "I'm not looking for a fight," he said, but it was clear Dunn wasn't listening. Every word out of the officer's mouth seemed designed to escalate the situation, to force Reed into a confrontation he didn't want. And just when it seemed like the officer would push him too far, a second siren blared, cutting through the standoff. A second patrol car had arrived. The newcomer, a woman, stepped out with a presence that immediately diffused some of the heat in the air. Her eyes locked onto Dunn, and without saying a word, she gave him a look that made it clear who was in charge now. Reed felt a small breath of relief, but the knot in his stomach remained. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now the storm had passed. The moment Officer Hall stepped between Reed and Dunn, the air seemed to shift, but not in the way Reed had hoped. Dunn froze, caught off guard by her sudden presence, but only for a split second. His eyes darkened with barely contained frustration, his jaw tightening as if he'd just been embarrassed in front of his peer. But then something else flared in his gaze. Anger. It was the kind of look a man gives when he feels challenged, when his authorities question, and when he realizes the power he thought he held might not be as absolute as he once believed. For a moment, Dunn said nothing. His posture stiffened, and Reed could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched near his holster. It was as if the officer was trying to decide if he should back down or double down and escalate this into something worse. And Reed, despite the sense of relief that Hall's presence brought, couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't over. Hall stood there for a beat, her eyes never leaving Dunn's. She was calm, composed, but Reed could see the thin thread of something fierce in her stance. Her arms were crossed in front of her, but not defensively, just matter-of-factly, as though she had been in this exact situation 100 times before. Reed wasn't sure what was going through her head, but he could see her calculating, reading the situation, picking her moment. The silence between the three of them was deafening. The weight of the flashing lights and the surrounding darkness seemed to close in around them, turning the quiet street into something more suffocating. Reed's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his thoughts racing. What if Dunn didn't back off? What if this became something worse than it already was? Then, as if in response to the rising tension, Dunn's voice cut through the stillness, low but laced with venom. "You're not going to lecture me, Hall. This man, he thinks he can just pull rank on me like he's above the law. He's not above anything. Not here, not now." Reed's pulse quickened. Dunn was losing control. Reed could feel it. There was a shift in the air. The thin veil of civility between them was unraveling, and Dunn was stepping closer to crossing a line that even Hall couldn't smooth over. "I'm not above anything," Reed said, his voice steady but sharp. "I'm here to ask you to do your job, officer, not to fight." But Dunn didn't hear him. His gaze was fixed on Hall, seething, and his hand moved almost involuntarily toward his radio. His fingers tightened on the device as he barked into it, his voice rising again, sharp and commanding. Reed's heart dropped. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. The moment that radio crackled to life, everything changed. In an instant, the situation escalated, as if the arrival of more officers was an inevitability, a signal that the night would spiral further out of control. Dunn wasn't backing down, and Reed knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about power. Who held it, who would use it, and who would be crushed beneath it. "Backup needed. We've got a disorderly man here. Thinks he's above the law." Dunn's voice blared through the radio, every syllable dripping with venom, as if trying to frame the entire encounter in a way that justified everything. Every action he'd taken so far, every step toward violence. The words hit Reed like a punch to the gut. It wasn't even about the truth anymore. It wasn't about what had happened, what had been said, or even the situation unfolding before them. It was about the narrative Dunn was creating. A narrative where Reed was the threat, where Reed was the problem. The black man in the uniform of a general who thought he was untouchable. And in Dunn's mind, maybe that was all that mattered. Hall stepped in, her expression hardening as she moved toward Dunn, speaking with a calmness that Reed envied. But her words were clipped now, more authoritative than they had been moments ago. Dunn, that's enough. This isn't what you think it is. But Dunn didn't listen. He wasn't listening anymore. The fury in his eyes had only grown stronger, and Reed could see that Hall's presence, far from calming him, had only intensified something deeper, something raw and ugly. Dunn turned his back on Hall, and in that split second, Reed saw it, a flash of a hand going to his holster. It all happened too fast. General Reed's instinct screamed. Before Dunn could even fully draw his weapon, Reed was out of the car. His legs moved almost faster than his mind could catch up, his military training taking over in a way that was instinctual. He needed to get out of that vehicle. Now the tight, stifling atmosphere inside the sedan had grown unbearable. As his boots hit the pavement, Reed felt the cold air wash over him, the rush of adrenaline shooting through his veins. He was no longer just a man in a car. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, and if he didn't move, this would break wide open. "Don't move, you piece of—" But it was too late. Dunn had already made his move. Before Reed could even fully process it, Dunn lunged. His body moved in a flash, his hands grabbing for Reed. But Reed's reflexes, honed through years of military training, kicked in. He sidestepped just as Dunn grabbed at him, his movements fast, controlled. Dunn stumbled, losing his footing for just a second. Reed didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, using the moment to create space, trying to break the officer's grasp. But Dunn wasn't about to let go. His body surged forward, his hand flying to his baton, the flash of metal catching the streetlight for a brief moment. Reed's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want this. He didn't want to fight, didn't want to escalate the situation, but he had no choice now. Dunn's face twisted with rage, his eyes wild with frustration. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Dunn spat, his breath coming fast and heavy, his hands shaking as he gripped the baton, the threat in his posture unmistakable. Reed's pulse hammered in his ears, and he stepped back, keeping his hands up in a defensive stance. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to end this peacefully. Was there a way out? Could he talk his way out of it? Could Hall finally step in and defuse this madness? But before he could respond, Dunn took another step toward him, this time faster with the baton raised. It was a blur. Too fast. Reed's body acted on its own. He ducked, sidestepping just as Dunn swung the baton, the blow cutting through the air just inches from his face. The thud of metal against the asphalt echoed in his ears as the officer lost his balance. Reed grabbed him by the wrist, trying to disarm him, trying to stop it before it got any worse. "Enough!" Reed shouted, his voice booming, raw with a desperation that surprised even him. But Dunn didn't stop. His fury had blinded him, and he swung again, faster this time. Reed dodged the blow, but his body was starting to feel the toll of the quick movement, the quick thinking. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion, it was the weight of it all, the feeling of being cornered, of being seen as the enemy. Every bone in his body screamed for him to stop, to de-escalate, but he wasn't sure there was any stopping it anymore. Then just as Dunn reared back for another strike, a new voice cut through the chaos. Hall's voice, sharp and commanding, rang out across the scene. "Dunn, no!" But it was too late. The baton came down in a swift arc, aimed directly at Reed's head. In that moment, time seemed to slow, and Reed's world narrowed to just the cold, jagged steel in the officer's hand. His body was already reacting before he could think. He shifted to the side, bringing his own arm up to block the strike, but the force of the blow caught him off guard. The impact jolted through his body, sending him crashing into the car. He hit the ground hard, his vision blurring, his breath knocked out of him. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All he could hear was the rush of blood in his ears and the distant sound of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. This was no longer just a traffic stop. It was a battle, a war fought in the streets, with power and rage on one side and survival on the other. And in this moment, Reed wasn't just fighting to stay on his feet. He was fighting for his very right to exist, unafraid, unthreatened, in the face of an enemy that had never seen him as anything but a target. The world seemed to tilt, the ground spinning beneath Reed's feet as he struggled to catch his breath. The pain from the baton's strike was sharp and immediate, but it wasn't just physical. It was the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. The years of service, the endless hours in uniform, the sacrifices made, and yet still, this. This was what it meant to be a black man in America, even in the position of power that Reed held. Even as a general, his identity was something other people could seize, twist, and weaponize against him. His mind raced with the overwhelming reality of the situation. The world around him felt like it was closing in, the flashing lights from the cruiser pulsing in time with the rapid beat of his heart. He could hear the sirens growing louder. Backup was coming, and with it, more chaos. He didn't know how long he was down. His arms were still shaking as he tried to push himself up, each movement painful and slow. His right hand pressed into the pavement, and for a moment he thought he might not be able to rise at all. But the sound of heavy boots approaching snapped him out of his daze. He looked up just in time to see Hall running toward him, her face set in grim determination, but her gaze flickering to the officers rushing from the second patrol car. "Stay down, General," Hall called, kneeling beside him, trying to steady him. "You're hurt. Let us handle this." But Reed could see her hesitation. He knew she wasn't entirely certain how this would play out. Not with the arrival of backup, not with the way things had escalated so fast. Before Reed could respond, the new officers reached them. 2 men and 1 woman, each of them tense, their hands hovering near their holsters, unsure of what to do. They hadn't been briefed, hadn't seen the way Dunn had attacked, the way Reed had been forced to defend himself. For all they knew, Reed was the aggressor, the threat. That was what Dunn had said over the radio, after all. The seed of doubt had already been planted. "You need to back off," one of the new officers barked at Hall, his hand now firmly gripping his baton. He wasn't looking at Reed, not yet, but Reed could feel his eyes on him, sizing him up like a piece of livestock. "Step aside, let us do our job." Reed's vision was starting to clear, but the room was still spinning. His entire body felt like it was on fire, but worse than the pain was the bitter taste in his mouth. The taste of injustice that lingered like ashes. His mind fought to stay focused, his military training reminding him to keep his cool, to avoid the traps of anger and fear that could derail everything. But there was no denying the overwhelming weight of it all. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a black man on the ground, bruised and battered, with a group of officers standing over him, ready to pass judgment. "Look," Hall said, standing up, her tone forceful but measured. She had a way of making people listen, especially when her voice carried the authority of someone who knew the system inside and out. This man did not initiate violence. Officer Dunn escalated this situation. He assaulted a superior officer. Her eyes locked on the officer who had spoken, daring him to challenge her. "You can either arrest him or you can go back to your car and rethink your position." The officer hesitated, looking between Hall and Dunn, whose face was flushed red, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and anger. It was clear he wasn't used to having his authority questioned, let alone challenged by someone like Hall, and certainly not by Reed, a man who was supposed to be on the same team as Dunn, but now, in this moment, stood at odds with everything he represented. "You're telling me to arrest Dunn?" the officer asked incredulously, his voice rising. There was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, but Reed could hear the underlying question in his words. How could this man, this general, be the one in the right? "We are telling you to do your job," Hall snapped back, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who had seen this all before, who had lived through the bureaucratic mess of a system that failed people like Reed every day. Dunn took a step back, his expression faltering for just a moment as his colleagues began to notice the weight of his actions, the damage done in that split second of aggression. The momentary pause only lasted a few breaths, but it was enough for Reed to recognize that things had shifted. The arrival of backup, meant to intimidate, had now become a catalyst for the truth to surface. Still, Dunn wasn't done. "This is bullshit," he muttered, his voice low but venomous. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage, a rage that Reed had seen too many times before, in far less personal moments, like watching a man beat down on a defenseless civilian, or hearing the stories of police brutality that had grown too familiar. "This is his fault, not mine," Dunn spat, pointing at Reed, his finger trembling with accusation. Hall turned toward him, her face hardening. "We have a witness, Dunn. Your actions will be reported, and we both know it's going to look bad for you." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Dunn stood there, the blood draining from his face, the reality of what was unfolding settling in. He looked around, his eyes darting between his colleagues, between Reed and Hall, and then down to the ground, his gaze dropping to the baton, still hanging loosely in his hand. It was over. Reed tried to push himself to his feet again, but Hall put a hand on his shoulder, gently urging him to stay down. His chest felt tight, his breathing still shallow, but he knew he couldn't let it end like this. Not like it always ended, with nothing changing, with everything swept under the rug. He needed to say something. "I don't want your sympathy," Reed rasped, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words felt like they had been years in the making. "I don't want your apology. What I want is accountability." His gaze found Dunn again, who was standing a little further away now, still holding the baton like it was some kind of lifeline. Reed's words landed with weight, with authority that none of the officers had expected. "You're the one who escalated this, and now you're going to be held accountable." The silence that followed was heavy, so thick that Reed could almost hear his heartbeat in the quiet of the night. Then the other officers stepped forward, the tension hanging between them as they assessed Dunn, as they reassessed the whole situation. Hall was right. They had a witness, and in that moment, the truth was undeniable. Dunn had crossed a line, and now it was his turn to face the consequences. The sirens were deafening now, the streets alive with the sound of approaching units, flashing lights and the uncertainty of what would come next. The chaos that had unfolded was far from over, but the tide had shifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Reed had the feeling that this time, the truth might actually come to light. But it wouldn't be easy. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Reed sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, his back pressed against the cold metal chair. His body ached, every muscle, every bruise, a reminder of the night that had unraveled everything. He could still feel the weight of Dunn's baton, the pain that came with it. But it wasn't just the physical wounds that were still raw. It was the shock, the anger and the betrayal that seemed to fester deep inside him. He had fought for a system that now seemed to be complicit in its own corruption. What had it all been for? He wasn't sure if the questions would ever stop. The door creaked open, and Hall stepped inside, her expression guarded but serious. Her uniform was disheveled from the chaos of the night, but there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself now, a certain resolve in her eyes that Reed hadn't seen before. She closed the door softly behind her, taking a seat across from him. "You good?" Hall asked, her voice low and careful, as if afraid of triggering some deep well of pain that Reed had yet to confront. Reed looked up at her, his gaze tired, distant. "Good?" He repeated the word softly, almost as if testing it. Good was a lie. He wasn't good, but it wasn't a lie he could admit to her. Not now, not after everything that had just unfolded. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he sat up straighter. "I'll be fine," he said finally, though the words felt hollow. "But I'm not sure this is fine." He gestured vaguely toward the world outside, toward the chaos they both knew was coming. "None of it is. This whole thing was never about me. It was about something much bigger. A system that's rigged. A system that's always going to be against people like me, no matter what uniform I wear." Hall didn't speak immediately. She just watched him, her eyes softening for a brief second before they hardened again. "I know," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "I wish I could tell you that you're wrong, that there's hope for this system. But you're right. The system is the problem, and it's been that way for a long time. She paused, looking down at her hands as if weighing every word before she spoke again. But you don't have to fight this battle alone, Reed. Not anymore. Reed's gaze snapped to hers, confusion flickering behind his eyes. What do you mean? He asked almost defensively. I mean, she started, leaning forward slightly, that what happened last night, it's not just your fight, it's everyone's. And we're going to make sure it gets the attention it deserves. Dunn isn't walking away from this. Not this time. She said it with such certainty that Reed felt the tiniest stir of hope, like a distant light flickering in the dark. The room fell into silence again, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind of silence. It was the kind that comes when two people who understand the weight of the world in a way few do find a common ground. Reed's heart beat a little faster now. It wasn't about hope anymore. It was about action. He had to see this through, no matter how difficult or dangerous it became. For him, for people like him, for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or hurt by a system designed to protect itself, not the people it was supposed to serve. He leaned back in his chair, his posture stiffening as the reality of what lay ahead began to settle over him like a weight. What happens next? He asked quietly, already knowing the answer. We go public. We get the evidence we need. And we bring Dunn down, Hall said, her voice resolute. But I need you to be ready. This won't be easy. It's not just going to be Dunn that we're up against. It's everything. The way this department has covered up for bad officers for years. The way it protects its own, no matter what. We need to bring that to light. We need to make them see that we're not backing down. She paused, her eyes softening just a fraction. Are you ready for that? Reed's eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance crossing his face. I don't have a choice, do I? He muttered, half to himself, half to Hall. Number you don't, Hall agreed, her voice quieter now. But you're not alone in this, Reed. And you need to understand that. This fight, it's bigger than Dunn. Bigger than just this department. It's about showing the world that we're not afraid to stand up to what's wrong. Reed nodded slowly, his mind already turning over the enormity of what she was asking. The fight for justice had never been simple, and it never would be. It would be long and grueling. There would be those who would try to bury the truth, silence his voice, make him regret speaking up. But Reed wasn't the man he'd been the night before. That man had been beaten down, broken by the system that had failed him. This man, the one sitting in front of Hall now, was determined to make sure Dunn, and everyone who thought they could get away with this kind of abuse, faced the consequences of their actions. Hall stood up and nodded toward the door. I'll get the ball rolling. I'll make sure we have everything we need to move forward. She turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. And Reed? I know you're angry. I know you're hurt. But you don't have to carry this on your own. Reed stared at her for a long moment, a strange, quiet gratitude filling his chest. Thank you, he said, the words heavy with meaning, more than just the simple acknowledgement of her help. It was an understanding. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He wasn't even fighting just for his dignity. He was fighting for the truth, for accountability, for the future of every officer who had ever been silenced by the system, every civilian who had ever been caught in the crossfire of systemic injustice. Hall's eyes softened, and she gave him a brief nod. We'll get him. We'll get all of them. She walked toward the door, pausing just before she left. Stay strong, General, she added, her voice full of quiet respect. Reed didn't watch her leave. He didn't need to. His mind was already elsewhere, running through the next steps, the next moves he'd have to make. There was still a battle ahead, one that would test his every limit, but he wasn't backing down, not this time. Dunn wasn't going to get away with it. Outside, the world was moving forward, oblivious to the quiet revolution that had just begun in that sterile room. But Reed knew. He could feel it. That change was coming, whether the system liked it or not. And he was going to make sure that when it arrived, it wasn't just a whisper. It was going to be a roar, a demand for justice. The days that followed were filled with endless meetings, hours of testimony, and a battle that Reed wasn't sure he was ready for. The initial rush of adrenaline that had kept him going in the aftermath of that night began to wane, replaced by a quiet, persistent exhaustion. He had to constantly remind himself of why he was doing this, to remind himself that every call he made, every decision, every moment he spent fighting this fight was bigger than his personal pain. It wasn't just about exposing Dunn for his actions. It was about exposing the system that allowed men like him to operate with impunity. Reed knew that this wasn't going to be an easy fight, and there were times when it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders, but he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. The support he'd received from Hall, from others in the department who were tired of the status quo, gave him something he hadn't expected, a glimmer of hope. People were starting to listen. The investigation into Dunn had gained traction quickly, fueled by the testimonies of Reed and Hall, the physical evidence, and the public outcry that followed the viral footage of the altercation. That video, taken by a bystander who had witnessed the incident, had become the tipping point, the undeniable evidence that the truth could no longer be ignored. Still, Reed wasn't naive. He knew how these things worked. He knew how the system fought back when its flaws were exposed. He had heard the whispers of people questioning his motives, of officers who tried to downplay the situation, of others who wanted him to just let it go and move on. It was the same song he had heard his whole life, a song that played in the background of every case of injustice, every overlooked act of violence. But Reed wasn't going to let it fade into the background this time. As the investigation moved forward, the public's attention turned to the broader issue at hand: police accountability, racial profiling, and the deeper systemic biases that plague law enforcement across the country. For the first time, Reed saw his pain mirrored in the faces of others, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, who had watched their loved ones disappear into a system that seemed bent on crushing them. They were all fighting the same fight, and now Reed understood that he wasn't just fighting for himself, or even for those who had been hurt in this specific instance. He was fighting for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of oppression. He was fighting for the future, for a world where things could be different. One afternoon, a few weeks after the incident, Reed sat in his apartment, looking out over the city. The view was familiar, comforting, but it didn't feel the same as it once had. He wasn't the same. Not after what had happened, not after everything he had witnessed. But as he stared out at the skyline, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet resolve that had settled in the depths of his bones. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. He could still hear the voices of the people demanding change, the voices of those who had been silenced for so long. He had become their voice, just as much as he had become his own. The phone buzzed on the table beside him, and Reed picked it up. It was a text from Hall. "We're getting there. This fight isn't over, but we're moving forward. Stay strong." He smiled to himself, the smallest of smiles, but it felt like a victory. He wasn't sure what the future held or how long this fight would last. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to stop. Reed's story wasn't the end. It was a spark in a much larger movement that was sweeping through the country. A movement that demanded change, accountability, and justice for those who had been pushed to the margins for far too long. His story wasn't a one-off incident, a fleeting moment in time. It was a reflection of the deep, unhealed wounds of a society that had ignored its own flaws for far too long. But it was also a story of resilience, of determination, and of the unyielding belief that things could be better. Not just for him, but for everyone. As Reed stood up, his body still sore from the fight, but his spirit stronger than ever, he knew that the real battle was still ahead. It wasn't enough to hold one officer accountable. It wasn't enough to win one case, to expose one corrupt individual. The system that allowed men like Dunn to act with impunity had to be dismantled, rebuilt, and reimagined. It wasn't just about changing the laws. It was about changing the way people thought, the way they saw each other, the way they treated each other. But Reed also knew this. Change didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because people decided they weren't going to sit back and let things stay the same. It happened when people chose to speak up, to stand up, to act. And that was the moment Reed realized he wasn't just a general anymore. He wasn't just a victim of the system. He wasn't just someone fighting for justice in a broken world. He was a catalyst. This fight, his fight, was about more than just him. It was about every single person who had ever felt the sting of injustice, every person who had ever been silenced or ignored. He wasn't fighting for an individual victory, he was fighting for a collective one, for the kind of world where accountability wasn't a choice, it was a given. A world where people of color didn't have to be afraid of the very systems that were supposed to protect them. A world where power was checked, and justice wasn't just a word, it was a reality. And as he walked toward the door, leaving his apartment behind him, Reed knew that he was just one person, but one person could change everything. The fight was long, and the road was hard, but it was a road worth traveling. The world was watching now, and Reed would make sure it never looked away again.